Star Wars has always been known for having a very positive and united fandom. Right from the moment the first film came out in 1977, the fandom has been joined in celebrating this wonderful franchise. The sequels to A New Hope were met with fantastic feedback. The prequels made decades later were universally loved and appreciated, and when Disney bought Star Wars, it seemed like the world in turn cheered. The subsequent sequel trilogy and following TV shows have been arguably the most unpolarizing pieces of media we've likely ever seen. In other words, the Star Wars fandom has always been a lovely place to be. Now, if you know anything about Star Wars, then you'll know that much of what I just said is just plain wrong. Nowadays, while there absolutely still are plenty of passionate Star Wars fans all around the world, the general consensus of the fandom in general is a little less hopeful. Star Wars is notorious for having one of the most rabid and vitriolic fandoms that any large franchise has ever had. And it absolutely did not start with the sequels. The Last Jedi was not the Kickstarter for the toxicity, it was merely the next victim of what we had seen before. Despite what it may seem, the original trilogy did have its fair share of critics, especially The Empire Strikes Back. Obviously, if there had been toxicity with some of this criticism, it would have been harder for it to have spread the same way it did from the prequels onwards, because the internet just wasn't as readily available then. But it still is noteworthy that there were critics who really did not see the magic in this film, a sentiment that has changed as years went by. However, I don't know if I'd label any of this discourse during this time as toxic, mainly because I wasn't there. To those of you who were, let me know down in the comments, how was it? Now this leads to an important distinction. What do I label as toxic? And what separates toxic fans from fans who are just being critical? Oftentimes you see people take offense to the use of toxic, saying that it's just a way to deflect valid criticism, or label people you don't agree with as harmful or problematic. And this is not really the case. A fan of Star Wars who didn't like a certain movie or TV show and voices their criticisms in a constructive and civil way, engaging in this discussion due to their love for the franchise rather than hatred, that's perfectly fine, and I believe necessary for a healthy fandom. You don't need to love everything from a franchise to be a fan, but I believe there needs to at least be some level of sincerity and passion for the franchise, and above all else, treating other fans with respect and kindness. You're both fans of this franchise, and although you may not see eye to eye, why should that change anything? Toxic fans, on the other hand, are just that. Toxic. They corrode, they corrupt, they poison. A toxic fan is actively participating in making the fandom a worse place to be in, where love and passion for the franchise isn't at the forefront, but rather bitterness, resentment, harassment, discrimination, hatred, abuse, all these things that just don't belong in a fandom because they actively make the fandom worse. A great example of this can be seen through the prequels. There was plenty of fair things to criticize the prequels for. If someone loves these movies, or if someone really doesn't like them, and they want to talk about this and discuss these things as fans of the franchise, that's absolutely fine. It should be encouraged. It's fun for me and my friends who like the prequels more than I do to discuss them, argue about them, because while we don't agree, it's still fun to talk about. Now, it wouldn't be fun if I was calling them names for liking the prequels, saying they're not real Star Wars fans, even being nasty about it. That would make me a fucking douchebag. That's the thing, it's not fair criticism to harass the actors to the point of ruining their lives and making them attempt suicide. It was not just being a fan for people to gatekeep the franchise and make fun of people for liking products that they didn't. The time of the prequels was filled with toxic fans, harassing each other, abusing other fans, bullying innocent people, even giving George Lucas so much hate that he fell out of love with his beloved franchise. The toxic hate towards the prequels really only seemed to die down once there was a new target for these vicious fans. After Disney acquired Lucasfilm and the sequels started coming out, we entered a new age of toxicity within the Star Wars fandom. The Force Awakens came out to a great reception, and while there were people who didn't like it, things really only got bad when The Last Jedi came out. This movie split the fanbase. It was either one of the greatest Star Wars movies ever, or the worst Star Wars movie to ever grace this good earth. To some, it was a beautifully told story, while to others, it had ruined their childhood. Just like how the prequels had apparently ruined the childhoods of some fans of the originals, to the point of making this stupid and incredibly offensive documentary about George Lucas. Do you see where I'm getting at? The cycle continues. Basically, for a couple of years, it was damn near impossible to have a regular conversation about The Last Jedi online. You couldn't just have a casual discussion about what parts of it you liked and what parts of it you disliked. There wasn't room for healthy arguments of why some people liked it and others didn't. You were either an ally of one side or the enemy. And yes, a lot of the criticism towards The Last Jedi was valid, and a lot of the love for The Last Jedi was valid too. That's fine to acknowledge, but you'd have to be incredibly dumb or just ignorant to try and claim that there wasn't a lot of fucking toxicity within the fandom at this time. Any positive opinion on the movie would be met with gatekeeping, insults, verbal abuse, bullying, harassment, bigotry even. And it wasn't just the fans, it was the actors, the creators, they all received hate. And if they didn't receive hate, then they were used as weapons against other parts of the fandom. Any unity that might once have existed within the fandom as a whole was completely shattered. And we're still feeling the ramifications of it to this day. It wouldn't be far-fetched at all to view the anti-woke reaction we see nowadays to every new piece of media as a direct continuation of the toxic Star Wars fandom. Whether it's a diverse cast in a fantasy show, an LGBTQ+ character in a Disney movie, a woman who's capable in a new superhero movie, even what we're now seeing with The Boys and the Acolyte, which we'll get to. It simply had a different name back in 2017, where it wasn't wokeness, but SJWs that people were whining about. There was a lot of content and discourse online about how feminism was ruining Star Wars, or that there were too many people of color or women, and that all the white men were either being erased or turned into villains. Any LGBTQ+ representation was seen as disgusting and a cancer to Star Wars. People were making racist posts about Kelly Marie Tran and cutting heads off her action figures. There was just so much disgusting bullshit. And while there absolutely still are millions of passionate and civil Star Wars fans around the world and online, things haven't really gotten much better. And the toxic parts of the fandom are still very much alive and continuing to make this online fandom a horrible community to be a part of. Since the sequel trilogy, Disney has been releasing a lot of Star Wars TV shows, and while I won't go too much into detail here, it's still worth mentioning that these shows also faced backlash from toxic fans. Yes, also valid criticisms naturally, but also a lot of toxicity. The Mandalorian started out pretty well received, but future seasons have had people crying about girl bosses stealing the show, and the same kind of criticisms have been seen for Book of Boba Fett. Andor was very well received, but instead of these fans who always complain about Star Wars perhaps now beginning to rave about Andor, saying that this is more like what they want, they instead just keep focusing on the negatives. Toxic hate can often be recognized through its heavy focus on negatives rather than positives. Again, it's not to say that a fan should only be positive about things, but in general, a fan does ultimately like the franchise that they're a fan of, and will want to highlight the good parts of it, right? Instead, the fandom menace and the anti-woke crowd almost never spend any lengthy amount of time on the media they actually do like, other than the occasional end-of-season review, but they will spend videos upon videos raging about a show before it comes out, while it's coming out, and long after it has come out. They quickly moved on to Ahsoka, calling it feminist propaganda. And I especially want to mention Obi-Wan Kenobi, a show where Reva, one of the main villains, got a lot of hate online. And naturally, it's perfectly fine not to like the character and talk about that online, explain why you don't like Reva's part in the story, and there were many people whose criticism was perfectly valid. But there was also actual racist hate that Moses Ingram received. This shit is not productive, it's not what a fandom should be doing. There should be no racism within the Star Wars fandom, and it was so fucking telling when Disney sent out a statement condemning racism that many people chose to get offended by it. Now listen, I'm not always a defender of Disney and what they stand for. They're a perfect example of capitalism and corporatism gone crazy, and taking advantage of progressive ideas and movements to make money, often with hollow and cheap inclusivity campaigns that, while I still believe ultimately have a net positive, are still only something they do because it's good for their brand and it makes them money. However, despite my qualms with Disney, this tweet is pretty unambiguous. It's calling out the racist comments that Moses Ingram received, and anyone who chose to get upset about this were outing themselves as a racist. It's not a normal thing to do. I didn't personally enjoy the character of Reva very much, but when I saw that tweet, I didn't go, "Fuck you, Lucasfilm, you're deflecting from valid criticism and calling us the fans racist." Because no, they were not calling me racist, because I am not racist. If you got upset at this tweet, that's really fucking telling. And this sadly happened a lot. The cycle of hatred within the fandom just seems to continue forever. The new thing gets hate while the old becomes loved and adored, and everyone forgets about how unfairly the old stuff was treated. This cycle is just so antithetical to the concept of a fandom. And this brings us to The Acolyte, the latest Star Wars show to stir up a whole heave of discourse, because of course it did. It had everything that mongrels on the internet are searching for in order to complain about and make content about. A diverse cast? Check. Disney Star Wars? Check. Interviews with the creator and actors talking about bigotry in the fandom and their own activism? Check. This show was destined to become a target of the anti-woke loud minority part of the fandom. It was expected. Still, it doesn't make it any less sad or annoying to see some of this backlash. And one of the main arguments against The Acolyte is its Rotten Tomatoes score, which has a critic score of 83 and an audience score of 14. And this would be a great argument if Rotten Tomatoes meant anything. The thing is, scores on Rotten Tomatoes are worthless when trying to gauge the quality of a show, especially when there's a whole lot of online discourse surrounding it. Review bombing absolutely happens, especially when a group of people online have reason to go and mass downvote something. Naturally, when massive anti-woke outrage channels like Nerdrotic, The Critical Drinker, and all the rest are making videos before and during the show's premiere, saying that it will be woke, that Disney is ruining Star Wars, and that The Acolyte is shitting on real fans of Star Wars, it's no fucking mystery why their fanbase is going in hordes to downvote the show. It also doesn't help that these channels glorify and celebrate shows with bad scores, posting every week how the audience score is still horrible. This makes their fans want to keep making the score lower and lower to own woke Disney. They see it as a win for themselves if The Acolyte has a low score, and so naturally they'll want to keep it that way. Only thing is that the audience score then becomes fucking meaningless. A fan of Star Wars who's interested in The Acolyte will be able to learn nothing from this, other than a lot of whiny people online are triggered by the show. Naturally, there are plenty of people who do not like The Acolyte. I'm not insinuating that it's only toxic fans who dislike it. Not at all, but review bombing doesn't only cover up the positive opinions of fans, it also covers up the genuine negative opinions. When people go to downvote a show because their messiahs told them to, it's actively hurting the genuine discussions that many fans want to be having about these shows, whether positive or negative. If you only look at Rotten Tomatoes, you'd assume that this is the most hated show of all time, but trust me, there are plenty of people who like or even love this show. They just don't feel the need to squeal about it online. And you may be wondering that, well, if the show is actually very popular, then why are these people who like it not reversing the review bombing? And that's simple. They don't care. A score on Rotten Tomatoes doesn't mean anything. It only means something to people with fragile egos who need affirmation that their opinions are correct because they're too fucking lonely. Also, hatred is a way more common cause for leaving a negative review than love is for leaving a positive review. Think of going to a restaurant. How many times have you left a review if the food and service met or even exceeded your expectations, compared to when the food and service was dog awful?
Raj! Come here, you. It's raw. It's fucking raw!
For most people, they're way more likely to leave reviews when something had been awful than if something had been amazing. It's the same thing with TV shows. Most people who like The Acolyte don't feel the need to leave a positive review and show everyone that this show is actually really good. But when this show's audience score is so linked with their culture war, and you feeling good about yourself or not relies on this show being bad, then you're way more likely to leave that negative rating. Rotten Tomatoes is a horrible way to engage with media. However, it's not just the use of Rotten Tomatoes that is souring the discourse surrounding the show. There's also just so much nitpicking and double standards in the arguments of haters that any critical discussions become exhausted with meaningless shit rather than meaningful analyses and discussions. Again, there are plenty of valid things to criticize the show for, but many of these larger channels that dedicate a lot of time to criticize the show hyperfixate on things like a fire burning in outer space. In a Star Wars show! Yes, active fire shouldn't exist in the vacuum of space, but this is Star Wars. It has never been realistic.
He's a former Padawan who could put out sustained fires in the vacuum of space. Sustained fires in the vacuum of space. Sustained fires in the vacuum of space. Fires in the vacuum of space. Fires in the vacuum of space. Sustained fires in the vacuum of space.
There have been plenty of fires throughout Star Wars, but now that it happens in a woke show with people of color and women, then it's suddenly a deal breaker to some people. It's just a sign of bad faith arguments. Also, that clip you just saw was from Hippoclipped, a new channel that in a lot less words than I use manages to completely debunk large grift channels and anti-woke sentiments. Their news video on the Critical Drinker is fantastic and deserves a watch. I'll keep showing some clips from their Acolyte videos, so let's get back to the video. There are also so many people complaining that the show is destroying the lore because a Sith was around in a time when there shouldn't have been any Sith, but they're not even doing the show the courtesy of waiting until it's finished to complain about this stuff. You don't know how they're gonna wrap it up. You don't know how they'll tie things together. Maybe all the Jedi who have seen the Sith die. Maybe the Sith aren't even Sith. Maybe the Jedi chose to cover this up and live in denial for hundreds of years because that is very in line with the Jedi. My point isn't that discussions of the lore aren't important or worth having, but rather that some of the haters of the show aren't even trying to be good faith to a show that isn't even finished yet. How often do we have all the answers before a show is even finished? People just want to hate, they were never willing to give the show a chance. People also place so much emphasis on Ki-Adi-Mundi, saying that the Sith have been gone for a millennia, but they just ignore that Ki-Adi-Mundi is chronically wrong. A lot of what he says in the prequels ends up not being true. He is a true product of the hubris of the Jedi.
Breaking, and yes, Ki-Adi-Mundi was in this episode. Now, the first thing that a lot of people thought was, oh, that's weird because, Ki-Adi-Mundi, very well known for saying this phrase.
Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
I do not believe the Sith could have returned without us knowing.
Somehow,
The Sith
returned.
Impossible.
I think the Count Dooku is behind it.
He is a political idealist, not a murderer.
Surrender, and your lives will be spared.
Impossible.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Ki-Adi-Mundi, very well known for saying this phrase.
Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium.
And to be fair, they don't exactly know if it's Sith or what it quite is. Yet fair, they don't exactly know if it's Sith.
And also, his age is so fucking irrelevant. George Lucas changed so many things that were previously canon. This is not new to Star Wars. The lore and canon gets bended to serve the story.
The problem is, Ki-Adi-Mundi shouldn't have been born for another 40 years. But this is Disney Star Wars. This make it make sense. But this is Disney Star Wars. But this is Disney Star Wars. This is Disney Star Wars. Disney Star Wars. Make it make sense.
And these blast points, too accurate for sand people. Only Imperial stormtroopers are so precise.
Breaking cameo. Canon breaking.
When I first knew him, your father was already a great pilot.
Anakin Skywalker, meet Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Canon breaking.
Do you remember your mother? Your real mother?
She was very beautiful, kind, but sad.
I have no memory of my mother.
Luke.
I have no memory of my mother.
She was very beautiful.
If you don't like the canon changing in The Acolyte, then you shouldn't like it anywhere in Star Wars. And let's not forget the bigotry we've seen within this discourse. Naturally, there are always those who will hate on a new Disney show because it has people of color, or women, or LGBTQ+ characters in it, because white men aren't still the large majority of characters. Oftentimes this hate leads to harassment and bullying of the creators and actors, and it's absolutely no surprise when even the largest content creators, someone as respected as the Critical Drinker, is playing into this bigoted bullshit, crying that there can be a room filled with children and he can't spot a single white one, and he whines about this to his rabid fan base, stacking in those views without a single thought to the harm he might be causing. It's a shame that bigotry is such a prevalent part of Star Wars discourse, and we need to keep calling it out because it's fucking disgusting. And listen, it's not even just the hatred that's the problem, it's the complete lack of unity within a supposed fandom, the always trying to one-up one another. It's pathetic. Things like using Mark Hamill to grow a divide and using him as an argument against The Last Jedi, but then casting him aside when he says something that those same people don't agree with, or using George Lucas's name to hate on things but not acknowledging the things he has said that disagrees with them, or even this blind hate of The Acolyte going so far that people are review bombing another movie from 2008 called Acolytes, and even this Star Wars fan film called The Acolyte. This isn't the behavior of a healthy fandom, and we need to keep addressing this. I know that there are millions of fans out there who still love Star Wars, and want to see it thrive, not laugh while it burns to the ground. There are many things that can be said about how George Lucas and now Disney have handled Star Wars, but I don't believe there should be any doubt that the fandom ruined Star Wars, that the fandom is still ruining Star Wars, and that unless something changes, the fandom will continue to ruin Star Wars. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you enjoyed and subscribe for more. Leave a comment down below on what you think of the video. But otherwise, I'll see you guys some other time. Peace out.